So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this evening's library talk. At the very outset, I would like to thank our sponsors, PC Chandra Jewelers and The Telegraph, for sponsoring this evening, and a special thanks to our member, Mr. Sayan Mukerji, who made this evening possible. I'm delighted and honored to welcome our guest this evening, Dr. Kunal Basu. While he really needs no introduction, yet for those who may not have known his varied interests and pursuits, Dr. Kunal Basu is an independent academic and author. Until recently, he was Professor of Marketing at the State Business School, University of Oxford, and a research fellow at the university's Green Templeton College. Prior to Oxford, he was an Associate Professor of Marketing at McGill University, Canada. Dr. Basu has received several distinguished teaching awards, including the prestigious Royal Bank of Canada Teaching Innovation Award. Dr. Basu was the founding director of the University of Oxford Center for Corporate Reputation and McGill University's Center for International Management Studies. He writes both in English and Bengali and is the author of severally critically acclaimed novels, including The Miniaturist and Kolkata. The Japanese Wife, from his collection of stories by the same name, has been made into an award-winning film by none other than Aparna Sen. He has also written novels in Bengali and for cinema. Born in Kolkata, he was educated in India and the United States. He lives between Oxford and Kolkata. This evening, he joins us from his home in Oxford for a candid conversation with Sayan Mukerji on a variety of subjects, including his forthcoming publications. Thank you, Dr. Basu, for being with us this evening, and on behalf of our members and their guests, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
In conversation with Dr. Kunal Basu this evening is our very own member, Mr. Sayan Mukerji, who again needs no introduction to all of you, but he's not the typical chartered accountant who is satisfied with mergers and acquisitions. After quitting his daytime job as vice president with Bears, he pursued his more meaningful interests with passion and zeal. Sayan loves his music and chess in equal proportion. He plays the piano, violin, and guitar, composes music, writes poetry, podcasts, has his own YouTube channel, and now a full edit and recording studio at home. Sayan has also participated in the National Chess Championship and has been a driving force in chess administration in Bengal over the last decade. On a personal note, Sayan was my senior in school, and I've had the pleasure and honor of knowing him for long, a very talented and a very versatile member, and I'm very, very grateful once again, Sayan, for making this evening possible, and welcome to you. So before we begin, ladies and gentlemen, just a little update. We are going to keep the audio on mute for all of you so that the speakers and other members of the audience face no disturbance during the conversation. But we would request you to post your questions on the chat box. So at the end of this session, we will put them across to Dr. Kunal Basu. Thank you so much for being here this evening, and over to you, Sayan.
Thank you, dear Shumit, for this generous introduction. Thank you, dear President, Mr. Amrish Dashgupta, for inviting me to host Candid Conversation at this prestigious club. Thank you, Dr. Shondeep Chatterjee, for your invaluable support for this evening. Welcome, my dear fellow members of Bengal Club and dear viewers from across India and many continents afar. We are here this evening with a very charming storyteller, a man not blinded by academic prowess, a mind not conditioned by the patterns of his outward success as an author and otherwise. A man who listens to his callings deeply, instinctively, seriously, and is not caught up in time. A man living in the complete freedom of his imagination. A man who is a world traveler and is willing to explore the unexplored, the unknown. Kunal Basu is also an Indian author of English fiction who has written 6 novels, The Opium Clerk in 2001, The Miniaturist in 2003, Racist in 2006, The Yellow Emperor's Cure in 2011, Kolkata in 2015, Sorojini's Mother in 2020, and The Endgame just prior to the pandemic. The title story of his only collection of short stories, as mentioned by Shumit, The Japanese Wife, was made into a film by Indian filmmaker Aparna Sen. We shall discuss this foray in greater detail later this evening. Kunal has also written 4 Bengali novels, Robi Shankar in 2016, by Ritdoja 2017, Tejashwani Shabnam 2018, and Angel in 2020, almost every year since his return to the country. This evening, we shall also be discussing some of Kunal Basu's newer projects at hand and get a sneak preview into his latest books to be released very soon. Can we have Dr. Basu on screen now? I think Gurudas will
Yeah,
have.
Dr. Basu is there in the screen.
Thank you, Dr. Basu, for joining us from your beautiful home back in Oxford. It's now nearly a month you have left Kolkata, hopefully to return by year end, as 2022 has so much to offer. Kunal, can we briefly start with the very beginning, especially with your intriguing place of birth and the circumstance? We shall then meander through your early life in Kolkata, your growing up years, your influences, your education, your formation of teenage identity, and your first love. How much did Kolkata shape you and your sensibilities? And we shall then discuss your books and outcome of your extraordinary journey through life. Kunal, you were born in Kolkata on the 4th of May, 1956, to Sunil Kumar Basu, a literator and publisher, and Chobi Basu, an author and an actress. Born to parents with strong left ideology, you were brought up on books and enriching conversations in a home which was often visited by a galaxy of prominent men and women of those years. Do tell us a bit about your illustrious parents who were avant-garde and were bohemians in their own right. And do touch upon your parents' ideological preferences, especially when West was collapsing around the Second World War, and there was an intellectual void across continents and more. Importantly, Bengal was passing through a crisis. Over to you, Kunal.
Thank you, Shayan. You know, it's a wet and rainy day in Oxford today, but it feels absolutely wonderful to be in the company of Bengal Club members. Thank you for having me. Well, as you said, I had an uncharacteristic childhood, to put it mildly. And my birth was very uncharacteristic. So my mum, who was a writer, was finishing a project for her publisher around the time I was supposed to be born. And on a fateful night, the night of 3rd of May, leading up to the 4th of May, dawn, she felt the stirrings that the child was about to arrive. But she told herself, I must finish my manuscript, because if I now left to go to the hospital, then my book will be postponed. Writers, as you can see, can be very obsessive. This is a trait that she has passed on to me, unfortunately. So my mom kept writing, but I wasn't willing to wait long enough for her to finish her manuscript. So very early in the morning of the 4th, I decided to come. And then the birth was hastily organized on the floor of my parents' library, surrounded by bookshelves. Okay. And an aunt was pressed into service. There was no emergency service in those days, and getting a doctor at that hour was problematic. And she took a pair of scissors and separated me from my mom. Now, that was a dangerous event, as you can imagine. But very fortunately, my father, running around like a madman, was able to find a doctor who came and then tidied us up, and the crisis passed. Okay. So I have a feeling that I was born under the gaze, under the bemused gaze of authors from all around the world, from the bookshelves. And I at least owe it to them to make an effort towards writing my own books.
And did you manage to get a formal birth certificate at some stage?
No, that's a very interesting point. My father was so taken up by the events of early morning that he forgot to register the birth of his son with the authorities, which is why I don't have a birth certificate. And this has caused me a lot of challenges later, and I had to get affidavits and things like that. But I think I'm all quite legitimate now. But as you were saying, Shayan, it was an exceptional household, and I was lucky to have been born in that household. because it was frequented by my parents' friends who were filmmakers like Satyajit Ray, Mrinal Sen, theater directors, poets like Subhash Mukhopadhyay, authors, political figures. And the house was full of conversation at all times, debates and discourses. Now, I was quite a sickly child when I was growing up. I had spent long, hours in bed. And I would eavesdrop on the conversation of my parents and their friends. And in that process, rather prematurely, acquired a sense of this world, the cultures of these different parts of the world, the politics, the ideas, the world of ideas was exposed to me when I was quite young.
And so your schooling happened in Kolkata itself?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Would
my
you like
schooling was in Kolkata. I also did my first degree in engineering, which was a kind of an anticlimax, to put it mildly, in India before I traveled to the US and got my master's and my PhD. Yeah.
And from your earlier years in school, did you get a feel of what was attracting you more? Was it mathematics? Was it history? Was it literature? So how did all that begin really from your early years?
I actually wanted to be an artist, a visual artist, a painter. Okay. And my parents tell me that I was a very naughty boy. And the only way to keep me quiet was to give me a sheet of paper and some colored pencils. And I would instantly, quieten down and do my art. I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be an actor on stage. I had early forays as a child actor in two of Mrinal Sen's films, Avasheshi and Punushcho, also acted in theater. But I had one fatal flaw. That fatal flaw was I was a very good student. And what that meant was I scored highly in subjects that I did not like. So for example, I wasn't fond of mathematics at all, but I used to get very high grades in mathematics. And it's all a part of the test-taking strategy, which somehow I must have acquired at an early age. Okay, so I had no real talent in mathematics, no real proclivity towards the subject. Okay, but on paper, on a mark sheet, my marks would be very good. So in our time, when we were growing up, we had to make our decisions as to whether we would study science or the humanities or commerce when we were in grade 8. Now, in grade 8, it's so hard to know what you want to be. What is it that you truly love? And my parents were classic liberals. So they said, study what you want to study. But I didn't know what I wished to study. So all my friends around me were studying science. So I studied science. I was not cut out for it. I wanted to leave science, but in my higher secondary examination, unfortunately, I got a rank. And then what happens when that, in those circumstances? People say, look, you're so good in mathematics, you're doing so well in science, you should study engineering. I had no clue what engineering was, and I studied engineering. Okay, so in other words, my lack of self-awareness and lack of mentorship in my early years propelled me towards a career, which was not a career of my choice. Now, unfortunately, we can't all go back, Shayan, and start life over again. But if I could go back and start life over again, I would simply draw. I'd simply be an artist.
So there would be a different A in the Kunal, which would take over. You've got so many A's in your avatar. Yeah, so we'll talk about those A's in various stages of your life. But interestingly, did your sister have any influence on you? Because I think she was in IIT, or did she give you a bit of insight about how you must proceed with your exams for going overseas and the rest?
Not really. She was a science student, a very good student, studied in IIT. And I remember when once she came back from IIT and said, you're about to finish your undergraduate degree in engineering. What are you going to do afterwards? And, funnily enough, and these days, everybody, our kids, are so switched on to career and career paths. I had none. So it was coming close to the end of my degree, and I didn't know really what I wanted to do. And she said, your compatriots in IIT, they're all taking an exam called the GRE. And if you do well in the GRE, then you might get a scholarship to study in America. I said, really? So somebody's actually going to pay me to travel around this world, only if I take an exam and do well. She said, yes. So I did. And again, I did well. I had a scholarship and I went to do a master's in engineering in America, not for the sake of engineering, but for the sake of seeing this world. And I took that opportunity and I traveled all around, hitchhiked all around the US, traveled in Europe in freezing cold weather. And, so that part of the objective was indeed satisfied.
How exceptional is that? So you need to share with us some of the experiences you've had in Florida. So this was this is after you finished your mechanical engineering, you went for your further studies, your MS in engineering, right? You were there for 2 years before you came back in 1980. So that period, you must have had some extraordinary experiences from the point of view of travel or visiting different countries, or all that, did that begin after you went back after 82? So can you tell us a bit about before 80s?
As a graduate student in America, you're dirt poor. You don't have funds to really travel as much. But, you can still travel if you travel by Greyhound buses and you hitch rides with friends, you ride share and do all of that. And I did that. But I always had the aspiration of even greater travels, travel at leisure, travel to all these amazing places, like travel to Peru and go to the Machu Picchu, which we did only 3 years back. Okay, so that period during my master's was fueled by the fantasy of travel and some amount of travel, but not a whole heck of a lot. And it really started after I went back from India to do my PhD and then became an assistant professor at McGill University in Montreal. And really at that point realized the possibilities that an enhanced income can provide to an individual. And for us, those possibilities, for Shushmita and me, those possibilities squarely lay in the domain of travel, going to places about which we had read, all the historical details that we had so much cherished about different parts of the world, the arts, not simply literature, but films and art and books and cinema, and really delving into the cosmopolitan experience of living in this world. But that really came a few years afterwards.
So I'm going to cut you abruptly at this point, because between the period 80 and 82 were watershed years for you in many ways, right? So would you like to just take us through that period before you transited back to the US? Because a lot of things happened those years, including meeting Shushmita. So I'd like to just have a little bit of that secret.
So here I was, Shan, returned from America with a master's degree in engineering, and I had no intention of becoming an engineer. So what does one do? Okay. In our time, there were not too many opportunities. I mean, today, it's possible to go into media, journalism, television, and things like that. Okay. By the time I was growing up, our choices were very limited. So I tried my hand as a reviewer of books, literary reviews for The Statesman, which paid a princely sum of 60 rupees per review. I couldn't sustain body and soul with that. I acted in Utpal Datta's People's Little Theatre, PLT, okay, and absolutely loved that experience and was enriched by the experience of the proximity to Utpal Datta. But in those days, theatre didn't pay, okay. So it was, so I was in many ways searching.
You even worked for an advertisement firm for a couple of months? Or?
I did, not far from Bengal Club in Theatre Road for about 3 months, and realized that I could not spend my entire life writing copy for cigarettes or tea. And so I was searching. I was saying, well, what should be my vocation then? I knew that I was a person in the arts, but I still need to put food on the table. And then I took this strategic decision, which is the only decision I credit myself for. I said, I must find a profession which is the least disruptive of the arts, the least disruptive of the arts. If I had a 9-to-5 job, or if I became a corporate executive whose work never really ends, okay, then I would not be able to pursue writing or acting or any of the arts. And I did not want to be a Sunday writer. So what does one do? At that point, I realized that the only recourse for me was to become a professor. Do a PhD, become a professor in a respected top research institution in this world where I would be my own boss, where I could do my own work, my research at my time, and spend the rest of the time as I wished, as a serious practitioner in literature. Okay, so that's what I did. I did a PhD. I had a job in McGill University. I published a whole heck of a lot of academic papers in the early years of my professional life so that I made tenure. And as soon as I made tenure, I said, okay, now is your chance to fulfill your dreams. I've done enough to ensure stability in life, but stability isn't enough. Stability can hardly sustain you for the rest of your life, but passion can sustain you for the rest of your life. So I must now indulge in my passion. And my passion was writing. So that's when I started. My first novel came out in 2001.
So that means the seeds for being an author was planted in the previous century itself. It wasn't just in 2000 when you actually brought out your novel. It's that planning for it.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I've grown up with writers around me. My mom was a writer. I've grown up with books. So writing was very much a part of my cultural portfolio, my artistic portfolio, if you wish, along with acting, along with art, and so forth. But over a period of time, my interest congealed more towards authorship, towards writing. Okay, and that's when I decided after my tenure at McGill that this is the time for me to wholeheartedly give myself to my writing interests.
And so this was, you were in McGill for how long? This was for quite a long period.
For 13 years before I moved to Oxford.
So that means that was the turn of the century, you moved to Oxford.
I did, with a manuscript under my arm. Okay. Having no idea how to get it published.
Kunal, I'm going to stop you again because you're deliberately fast forwarding. You're missing out 1982. I need you to recollect 1982 in its briefest yet romantic form. That what happened in 1982?
I met Shushmita. I met Shushmita under the strangest of circumstances. As you can imagine by now, and dear friends of Bengal Club, my life is full of strange coincidences. And it was a strange but happy coincidence in 1982 when I was actually leaving our home in South Kolkata, with a camera in my hand. In those days, I really had some advanced interests in photography. And I was going to North Kolkata, which is our ancestral home, Shambhajar, to take photographs of old Calcutta. Okay, the narrow lanes of old Calcutta, the old houses of Kolkata, and so on and so forth. But in Bengal, where it rains a lot, there's a problem of fungus on your lenses. Okay, so before I left, I was walking out of the house and I was looking through my lenses to see if there was any fungus. Okay, and I saw this woman pass by. Okay, and I was curious, instantly curious. I mean, who is this person? I mean, I thought I knew every young lady in my neighborhood, but I'd never met her. Okay. So I walked behind her and I saw that she went into a house behind ours and later made some inquiries and found that she was a person called Shushmita, who was a student in Vishwabharati in Shantiniketan. And I caught a train, arrived at the steps of our hostel and introduced myself to her. Okay. And after a very brief courtship, we decided to get married. So that's the happy coincidence of 1982.
Oh, lovely. And she went back with you while you were pursuing your PhD at that stage itself.
That's right.
And Ajlai was born a couple of years later?
No, a year later, actually.
A year later.
When I was doing my PhD, Ajlai decided to arrive. Just as I wanted to arrive and I made my presence felt to my mum, she did hers. And we were very happy to have her. Doing a PhD and becoming a young father is not
very
easy.
Challenging. Yeah.
However, I never felt the challenge because kids can make you feel that there is no greater challenge on earth. than being with them. And so, yeah, she grew up in, as a child of a PhD student, and now she's a PhD herself.
Incredible. Yeah. So Kunal, I need you to briefly tell us, you've had such incredible experiences while you were both in US and Canada, including your number of travels to China, I think some record 12 number of times. So what are the most outstanding kind of, memories you have had during that stint, both across in USA and Canada?
Yeah.
Before you move
travel sort of makes you confront the unexpected. And all of us who've traveled in, for leisure or for work in different parts of the world, we've had a share of unexpected events. I'm going to tell you about one of them. In 1989, when I was still a very young assistant professor at McGill, I went to teach a course in China, in Beijing, at the People's University. Now, Shushmita was a student of Chinese language at McGill. And so we've traveled many times to China since 1989, both for my academic and professional reasons, and also for Shushmita's language training and so forth. But 1989 was our very first trip. And we arrived in China and was lodged in the university, in the foreign experts building. And we could immediately see that a students' movement was brewing. Now, that movement came to be known as the Tiananmen Square movement. Okay, so we spent a whole month in Beijing during that movement, the students' movement. All classes were canceled. I could not teach. Okay, so every day the dean of students in China would very apologetically come to our apartment and say, "I'm very sorry, Professor Basu, your students are not coming to your class today. We think they'll come back next week." And that next week never arrived because the student movement was in full force. I used to travel with these young boys and girls to Tiananmen Square, okay, and take photographs and interview. Shushmita was a great help because she could translate from Chinese to English and Bengali to me. And then that fateful night of 3rd of June and 4th of June arrived, when those awful things happened in Beijing and in Tiananmen Square. And on the 7th of July, we were evacuated by the government of China, first to Japan, and from there we traveled. We went to Hong Kong and came to India.
My God.
So that was in many ways a watershed event in our lives, not simply for the dangers that were involved, but it taught us a lot of things. For me, it taught me that however imperfect, however much we criticize our country, India, there is no alternative to democracy. Now, there is no alternative to a system where people can speak their minds and not be shot for that, not being put into jail for that. And so in many ways, it sort of expanded our minds and gave us notions about life and society that we cherish till today.
Oh. So this was in '89. And also, I think the Indonesian riots, you were part of.
No, I mean, I was also teaching in Indonesia when Suharto was deposed in a coup and had to make a mad dash in Jakarta to the airport to catch my flight back to Canada. So I've had my brushes with these kinds of situations. And I often tell friends, look, you shouldn't travel with me because who knows what's going to happen in those travels.
It's really interesting. So after that, that means, and then when you shifted to Oxford, you've had 20 long years at Oxford, at SAID, and that's where you really got into doing two shifts, right? I mean, basically it's your writing and your academics. So the 3 A's, the 4 A's became 2 A's to become a final A finally, which is happening now. So could you just take us a bit into that before we get onto your books? So how did that rigorous curriculum in Oxford, where you were completely immersed in academics, yet you were trying and finding time to get out and start off with your books? Because I think all your books happened one after the other in the last 10 years. And the first book started 20 years back, exactly 20 years ago. So could you just tell us a bit about that? Then we can get into your start off with your books, really.
You know, there's an advantage in Oxford for a senior academic. When I came to Oxford as a senior academic, not as a junior person. And the advantage of being in Oxford or Cambridge as a senior academic is that you have to do very little administration, okay? Which is a real contrast to being in the US or in Canada, where the more senior you become in the system, more time you have to spend, become director of this program, a dean of that, or an associate dean of this, sit in umpteen committees. And I'm a very impatient person. I don't have a lot of time for committees. Okay. So when Oxford made me an offer, I said, why would I want to come here? I'm actually quite happy at McGill. And they said, what is the one thing in your life that you cherish the most? Very important question, right? Very interesting question to ponder. And I said, the most important thing in my life is time. Because I started to write my first novel. And I was a senior academic with PhD students, etc. So for me, time was of the essence. And they said, well, what do you mean time? I said, look, if I move to Oxford, I do not want to teach undergraduates, which I love, but it takes a lot of your time. I do not want to have administrative positions. All I want to do is teach very senior executives or PhD students, and that's it, and do my research. Okay. And they agreed wholeheartedly, and that's what brought me to Oxford. And it is the circumstances of that kind of an academic position that allowed me to actually spend a huge amount of time for my writing. I have written 16 books so far in fiction. Only one of them was written away from Oxford, which is my first novel, which I finished when I was in Canada, brought it over with me to England and had it published here. But all the subsequent books have been written here on this desk, actually, and facing this tree.
So Kunal, you are one of the very few Indian practitioners of historical fiction. In fact, 4 of your 6 novels have historical backgrounds. Apart from your love of history, perhaps it has something to do with the influence of your favorite author, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, has had on your life. Bankim himself, influenced by Walter Scott, was a writer of historical novels, as were many other Bengali writers of the 19th and 20th centuries. When you avidly, which I think as a child you grew up with that, including Ramesh Chandra Datta and Sharadindu Bandyopadhyay. But more than anything else, you have often said, what draws you most to this genre is the romantic possibilities of the historical novel, the scope to inhabit other places and times, and thus enable the reader to romance the strange, the unexpected. Your take on that, Kunal?
Yeah, it's precisely that. Yeah, I'd grown up with, and history was one of my favorite subjects. We had a lot of history books at home because my mom studied history for her degrees. We were very historically oriented as a family, not simply Indian history, but history of the world. And as you said, history really provides a lot of fodder for the romantic imagination. There's so many characters when you read a particular historical period. There's so many characters that come in and fleet and leave, and we don't know much about them. They're incomplete stories or events. And you begin to imagine and say, well, what if I was in that world? What would I have seen? What would have been my experience? So if you think about The Opium Clerk, my first novel, which is set in the world of the opium trade, the British opium trade, where the British grew the opium in India and shipped it to China. We know the history. The 2 opium wars resulted. Hong Kong was ceded to the British, and an entire empire was formed on the basis of this heinous drug, okay, and which attracted people from many different pursuits. Okay, I stumbled upon this story, and so let me tell you a little bit about how I stumbled upon this story. Okay, Shushmita, our daughter Ajlai, and I, we were trekking in northern Thailand some years back, some decades back actually, in the Golden Triangle area. And my trekking guide gave me a dog-eared paperback to read, because the evenings when you're trekking can be very boring. You've come back from your trek, you're tired, you have to pass the evening, and next day you begin to trek again. Now, I had no interest in the international drug trade. I had no interest in sort of heroin and the Golden Triangle and all of that. It was not within my scope of imagination at all at that point. But as I was turning the pages of that book, bored and trying to get through the evening, a phrase leapt out at me. And that phrase was, in the 19th century, Calcutta was the center of the world's drug trade. And I said, this can't be true. This is not true. I'm a thoroughbred Calcuttan. I was born and raised in this city. I go generations back, North Calcutta, old North Calcutta family. I go back generations in this city. I've studied my history in this city in school. Okay, nobody has ever told me or taught me about the role Calcutta played as the auction house for Indian opium in Alipur. So I said, okay, when I get back to McGill, let me go to the library and start reading up and to see whether this is indeed true or not. And so I did that. And as I opened books of history and started reading about the history of the opium trade, the whole novel revealed itself in front of my eyes. And I said, can you imagine that my city played such a strong role, not simply in this country, but in China, in Malaya, in the continuation of British colonialism. And there were all kinds of characters: Bengalis, Parsis, the French, the English, Anglo-Indians, the Chinese, the Malays, and a whole cast of characters revealed themselves to me. Okay, that's the romance of history. And I said, what if I can think about a character, a Bengali, who is a clerk, is nothing more than a clerk, a Karani, in the opium enterprise, in the auction house for Indian opium in Kolkata. How would he have seen this world? Okay, and that's how the story of the opium clerk came about. So, yeah, to your question, history offers imagination these romantic possibilities.
But Kunal, you maintain this fine balance with history. In many ways, you flirt with it with a purpose. You like it to fertilize the mind, yet you don't want to get too caught up with historical facts.
Yeah.
Is that a trick which you do over this period of time as a writer? You have to know exactly how far to go, or it shouldn't divert your attention, really.
As a professor, I tell my students, especially those who are doing their doctoral degrees with me, that you must read everything on your subject, everything ever published on the topic, everything. Okay. Now, when it comes to being a writer of historical fiction, this is dangerous advice. This is dangerous and wrong advice, because if you read everything, then your mind gets trapped in the domain of factual information, and it cannot breathe, it cannot imagine, it cannot make up. Okay, so I read just enough so I know the basics, so that it can fertilize my imagination, and then I can take off based on those historical facts and create my own narrative. Okay, so reading is important, library research is important, archival work is important, and I do that. Being a professor helps me to determine what's important, what's not important to read, how much should I read, when should I stop reading. Okay, but it's important to stop reading. It's important to allow your writerly mind to come out.
Well said. But some commentators have said that a thread that runs through most of your writings is a theme of compassion, and the power of compassion to overcome personal tragedies, personal circumstances, as well as civilizational changes. In the opium clerk, certainly, in the miniaturist, differently, both at the personal level and at races, perhaps at cross-civilization level. And you have earlier mentioned that I don't consciously think too much about what the connectivity is, what the unifying themes are. I'm moved by stories and really need to get a glimpse into the origin of these stories deep within you. So we really need to understand, how does it start? How every story of yours is so unique and different and set in a completely different locale. So how do the seed of a story get into you? We could start with any of your novels to give a bit of an example, or or you could be generic also. I mean, as an author, this is a secret which you have imbibed, and you have done this with your keen sense of observation. You're always alert to what is happening around you. It's just not being created sitting in that lovely little home of yours. You're out in the street, you're meeting people, you're trying to get stories out from reality. Is that a way you go about it?
Yeah. Look, I'm not a professional historian. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a sociologist. It is not my objective to take a particular theory and say, I'm going to spin a story around it. Okay, that's not what I'm about. And that's not what I'm interested in doing. The most difficult question to answer, Shayan, is, why did you think of this story? Or how did you think of this story? Because the human mind is a very strange piece of apparatus. We overhear conversations. If you're sitting in a train or in a bus and two people are talking in front of you, if you pay attention, what are you doing? You're getting a window into their life. When you read newspapers in the morning, hidden somewhere in the newspaper is a small little piece of news, almost inconsequential. It gives you an idea. Okay. And so it's very hard to say, I'll give you an example soon, where the story comes from. But for me, the starting point has always been a story. I need to think of a story which keeps me awake at night, that I have to tell. Okay. And once I've thought such a story, then my method takes over. Then I say, okay, now if this is my story, how do I go about writing it? What do I need to read? Who do I need to talk to? Which person do I need to interview? Which location or country do I need to visit? And that's the work of preparing myself to write. But the impulse to write comes from a story. So think of The Japanese Wife, okay, which most people say is such an odd story, isn't it? A Bengali village school teacher falls in love and marries a Japanese who he has never met. Okay, how did that come about? So many, many, many years ago, when I was in college, I was traveling with a friend of mine through South Chobbish Pargana, not far from Kolkata. And we were waiting by the side of a river to catch a ferry. And this friend of mine who was from that neighborhood, from that part, a village nearby, said, see that gentleman standing there? And he pointed to a gentleman, portly, middle-aged, balding, wearing dhoti kurta and holding an umbrella in his hand. I said, yeah, who is he? He said, he's a school teacher. I said, I see. He has a Japanese wife. I said, what? A Japanese wife? He said, yeah, he's married to a Japanese. Okay. Now, I consider this to be great good fortune that I did not ask my friend any follow-up questions. Say, look, in a city like Kolkata or Delhi or Mumbai, you can find people who have foreign spouses. But in a village, in South Chobbish Pargana, a person with a Japanese wife, I could have asked my friend a whole lot of questions. How did he meet his wife? Does he go to Japan? Does she come here? Do they have kids? What languages do the kids speak in? Okay, I could have flooded him with questions. But my mind was elsewhere at that time, and I did not ask him any questions. The only piece of information that stayed lodged inside my brain was a school teacher in rural Bengal with a Japanese wife. 25 years later, when there was a snowstorm raging outside my window in Montreal, I sat at my desk and started writing the story of the Japanese wife. See what a strange thing the human mind is? Okay, how it takes a small piece of information, an encounter, decades back, and then it connects me in my mind and makes me begin to imagine a story. And that's how it came out, the Japanese wife.
Sad. But you need to also share how Aparna Sen met you and I won't use the word coerced you, but she very subtly influenced you to get this out as a publication so that she can make
No, she didn't influence me to get it out as as a published piece. She was visiting a friend of ours who's a very well-known Indian historian called Professor Tapan Rai Chaudhary, who's since passed away. So they were very dear friends of ours, Tapan and Hashidi, much senior to us, but they really, very, very affectionate towards Shushmita and me. And one day he said, well, Kunal and Shushmita come home for dinner. And Hashidi was famed for her cooking prowess. She would never miss a dinner which she is prepared. But I had a college event that day. And I said, Topanda, it's not going to happen. I've got a college event. I'm afraid I'll be held up. He said, oh, no, you must come. Apurna Sen is going to be coming. Mm-hmm. Now, I've grown up with a house full of what people today call celebrities, very famous people. And I have absolutely no hankering for celebrities, never had. And so it got my back up a little bit. I said, why do I have to come? Because an important person is coming to visit you. But Shushmita prevailed upon me and said, look, they're elderly people. They've invited us for dinner. We should go. And we should probably go, if you don't have the time, we'll go after dinner. We'll have coffee and cakes. And that's why we went. And as soon as we arrived, there's a whole house full of mostly Bengalis who've come from London, some from Oxford and elsewhere to see their celebrity. Aparna walks through the crowd to me and says, oh, I was dying to meet you because you wrote my favorite novel, The Miniaturist. The Miniaturist was my second novel. And look, all of us are open to flattery. And I was immediately, my mood improved. I started feeling good. My grumpiness disappeared. Okay. And we started chatting about this and that, and I obviously seen her films. And she said, I would love to make a love story, except that all love stories have been written already, done already. Romeo and Juliet, and you name it. I wasn't pitching a story to her. I had a glass of wine in my hand and I said, no, I have a love story which is very different from others. She says, okay, tell me. And in about 5 minutes or 7 minutes, I told her the gist of the story of the Japanese wife. And she said, have you sold it to anyone? I said, sold meaning what? I mean, have you sold it to a filmmaker? I said, no. In fact, I haven't even published it because, in England, there is this view in publishing that unless you become very well known as a novelist, you don't publish a collection of short stories. Now, I was beginning to be well recognized in Britain. And so she didn't actually influence me to publish the book. She said, will you send me this story, please? I want to read it. And I said, I sent it to her. And only when she decided to make the film, then my agent said, look, Kunal, when the film is released, people will say, based on a story by Kunal Basu, but where is the story? So you must now think about putting together your short stories and bringing it out as a book, which is what I did.
I get that. And very few people know that you've had a small cameo role there in the movie, right? With Rahul, Raima Sen, and Chingusu Tukasa, or what was the name really?
Chigasu, yeah.
Tikasu, okay. So we can see you. You'll have to tell me which period of time I need to keep my eyes open in the film to see you when I see Japanese wife next, right? So that's interesting trivia. Oh, that's lovely. Now, Kunal, it's important that we get back to something really very dear to you, that is Calcutta. In 3 of your books of late, you've got Calcutta and club life and social life and everything to do with clubs somehow very beautifully woven into your story and text. Would you like to talk about the club culture in Calcutta and why it's so important and why you thought it's important to have that in your book? And strangely, Bengal Club also mentioned somewhere in between one of your novels. So the little secret you need to share, really.
Yeah. Look, as I had mentioned earlier, I'm a thoroughbred Kolkatan, but I had not written a contemporary novel set in Kolkata for a very long time. And my agent in London and my publisher in London would oftentimes tell me, oh, Kunal, you're a Calcutta boy. Why don't you write a Calcutta novel? I said, look, I don't write novels like that. I need to think of a story that really moves me. And I feel that I have to write it. And if it happens to be a story which is set in Calcutta, then I would write it. Okay. Obviously, The Opium Clerk, my first novel, had a substantial chunk of Calcutta, but that was 19th century Calcutta. okay? Not contemporary Kolkata. And so it wasn't until this novel called Kolkata that I actually delved into contemporary life in this city, okay? And that too came about in a very strange way, because I like walking around in Kolkata. I try to avoid traveling by car. I take public transport, I walk, or I take if it's very far, I take an Uber. So, and at all times of the day and night, I'm sort of walking around the city. And one time, on Southern Street, and you would all know Southern Street very well, behind the Indian Museum, there are these small little guest houses. And most of the time, the foreign backpackers, the foreign tourists who are on a low budget, would come and stay in these lodges. Okay, and I was walking around in that area at night, and I saw a number of young men, very well dressed, very good looking. Okay, gold chain and expensive perfume, sitting on motorcycles. And so that piqued my curiosity. Who are these boys? What are they doing here? So I went to a juice bar and I struck up a conversation with one of the, with the owner, and I said, in log kaun hai? Kya karte hain yahan pe? What do they do? And they said, they're tour guides. They take these foreign tourists to tours. I said, okay, what else do they do? And he said, well, if they need drugs or something. So I know, okay, so there was some shady business going on here. So, if they wanted drugs, these guys would procure them for them. I said, aur dusra kya karte hain? And then this guy said just one sentence, aur koi seva lage to. I said, aur kya seva ho sakta hai? And then it struck me, could these guys be male prostitutes? And do you actually have a community of such people in Kolkata? Now, I am a thoroughbred Kolkatan. I've never met a person like this. My guess is none of us would, or very few of us would know of this. And I said, there's a story in here. There is a story in here. Who are these boys? What do they do? What is their life like? What do their families think? What do they aspire? What are their dreams? Okay. And for 2 years, I started, with the help of the police, with the help of people I know in Kolkata, who are very, very helpful to me. I started researching the life of the gigolo in Kolkata, the male prostitute in Kolkata. And that's how Kolkata was born. And I realized that we tend to think of Kolkata as a Bengali city, the world of the Bengali intelligentsia. Okay, that we are the center of the city and everybody else is the periphery. Whereas actually, 52% of Calcutta's population is non-Bengali. Okay, and a large number of these people, the protagonists of this novel of mine, Kolkata, etc., they are from Zakaria Street, Chitpur, in that area. Okay, and to them, we are the periphery. We are the outliers, and the center of the city is elsewhere. Okay, so I wrote this novel about this, the imaginary story about this guy who falls into this profession, not because of choice, but because of circumstances. Okay, and how he sees the rest of the city through his eyes, not through the eye of an upper class Bengali intelligentsia, an educated professional, but a person of the streets, who's desperate to fit into this world and has to overcome challenges that none of us can dream of. You mentioned club culture. Kolkata is one of those very rare cities which has this thing called the club culture. Obviously inspired by the British. In Oxford, actually, there are no clubs in Oxford. Okay, I mean, the students have some student societies, but there are no social clubs in Oxford. In London, there are a few, but they're not a part of the social landscape as much as in Kolkata, clubs are a part of the social landscape. And for a long period of time, I was very apprehensive going into any club. Most clubs have this, dress etiquette. You need to be dressed in certain kinds of ways, and so on and so forth, which really came across to me as being anachronistic in this day and age, in the 20th and 21st centuries. But be as it may, I found them to be exciting settings to craft stories or parts of stories. So in Kolkata, Calcutta Club features. I don't call it Calcutta Club. I call it Plantation Club because you can't really name a place like that. And some of the action happens there. In one of my more recent novels, Sarojini's Mother, a lot of the action happens in Bengal Club, in your club. Okay, although they haven't called it Bengal Club. Okay, there, the Hamilton Room and things like that. So I talk about parties and dinners, and important characters of my novel meet there at the Bengal Club, and important business is conducted between them. So I'm intrigued by many different spaces that we have. You've got Zakaria Street, you've got Khidirpur, you've got the Victoria Memorial, you've got the Calcutta Club and the Bengal Club. All of them coexist in this city, which makes Kolkata so fascinating. It is not one kind of city or a city meant for one kind of people. Okay, it has huge diversity, which for an author is a gold mine.
I can well imagine what you're saying, because you're trying to make it completely different from the understanding we have had of Kolkata through V.S. Naipaul, who once described Calcutta as a slowly dying city. Rudyard Kipling had said Calcutta is the most wickedest place on earth. And the city has been subject to several books, including novels of City of Joy and a non-fiction portrait by Amit Chaudhary called Calcutta. But your Calcutta has a distinctive flavor of its own, with incredible pace and lots of characters and mystery and intrigue, and it's so layered. So it's an incredible book. I remember reading it and finishing it in 3 nights. I couldn't let go. So the moment you start from page 1, you need to finish the whole book, and then you say, I'm done with it. So it's incredible. I really love that. So would we like to talk about one of your Bengali books also, which I think before I do that, I'll just briefly, I think everyone knows this, right? Kunal Basu is the only bilingual English-Bengali novelist after Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, and he had given up writing in English after his first English novel, Rajmohan's Wife, way back in 1864. So Kunal Basu has written 4 Bengali novels: Ravi Shankar in 2016, Bayre Dorja in 2017, Tejashwini at Shabnam in 2018, and Angel in 2020. So why did you think to move to Bengali writings? And all of this has happened in the last 5 years or so.
Well, I didn't move in the sense that I've never abandoned English to write in Bangla, just as I've never abandoned Bangla to write in English. Look, we were fortunate at the time when we were growing up in Kolkata and studying in schools and having teachers here, that we didn't have to choose between English and Bangla when it comes to literature. Okay, so we would read Rabindranath, Sharat Chandra, Manik Bandyopadhyay, Bankim Chandra, and others in Bangla, and also we would read the great classics of this world in English and through English, the Russian classics through English. Okay, never felt that the two were in competition. And always felt that there were 2 literary streams flowing within us, a certain generation, Bengalis for a certain generation, who I call the truly most bilingual tribe on earth. Okay, it's not simply the case that many of us read, write, and speak both languages very fluently, but we can also delve into the literary currents of these 2 languages with ease. I never felt that I needed to write, I want to get away from Bangla, or I need to get away from English. But it did strike me that, I've been telling a lot of people, my friends around the world, about how bilingual in literary terms Bengalis can be, but I have never written a novel in Bangla. And so I said, well, okay, I'm now going to write a novel in Bangla and see what it does to me as a writer. Okay, and I did, and I wrote 4 Bengali novels in a trot. One after the other. Of course, since then I've gone back and written 3 other novels in English and a collection of short stories also in English, which awaits publication. So I would want to go from one to the other depending upon the story that I'm telling. People have asked me, why didn't you write The Japanese Wife in Bangla? Could it have been written in Bangla? Of course it could have been. Okay, but when I was thinking of the story, the first line of the story appeared to me. It was a line in English. she sent him kites. She sent him kites. And somehow that one line propelled me to write this story in English. Tejoshini o Shabnam. My agent in the UK, when I told her about this novel, she said, why didn't you write this in English, Kunal? It's a novel which is set in Iraq after the death of Saddam Hussein. And the war is raging in Iraq. It's a story about an unlikely friendship of two Bengali women. One of them, an NRI Bengali, grew up in New York, who is a war correspondent. So for example, for a company like CNN, she's come to cover the war from CNN. And the other is a trafficked woman from the Sundarbans, who's been trafficked and sent to the Middle East as a prostitute. And these two women on both sides of the spectrum, a CNN journalist and a trafficked woman, they meet and they become friends. Okay. It's called Tejoshini o Shabnam. It has been translated into English called The End Game, and its Odia translation is coming out soon, I think early next year. So again, when I thought of that story and when I was researching that story, it seemed to me to be appropriate that I write the story in Bangla. But could it have been written in English? Of course it could have been. Yeah. So I do not give myself a mandate that I have to write in this language or in that language, although it's true that I've written most of my work in English.
Yeah, Kunal, you have the advantage of just choosing effortlessly either of the languages. It's not very easy for one to switch and think in one language and write in another language. So you're thinking in English and writing in English, thinking in Bengali and writing in Bengali. So that itself is a skill set which is unparalleled, really. But I think we are now slowly coming towards, we're running out of time, and Shumit's going to bug me very soon. So before that, Kunal, would you like to share some of the new books which are coming out later this year, early next year, including what your projects are? And
yeah, there are two books I would talk about briefly, only briefly because they are yet to be published. And I've never talked about them in a public forum. So the Bengal Club Forum is the very first time I'm going to publicly be talking about these books. Okay. So it's my next novel in English called In an Ideal World. In an Ideal World, which is going to come out in January. Penguin Random House will publish it in India. So that's coming. It's really just a few months away. It's a novel which has taken me by surprise. I've never written before an explicitly political novel. I haven't. Okay. But I've been very troubled, like many of people that I know, of what has been happening in our country in the last 6, 7, 8 years. We had grown up with the notion of India being a pluralistic, diverse, secular, liberal democracy. Not perfect, but despite its imperfections, the ideal of India was that we are inclusive, and there's no animosity between people of different religions, castes, and so on and so forth. It's an ideal, but that's the ideal we'd grown up with. In the last 6 or 7, 8 years, a different idea of India has gathered the headlines and rules the country. That's the notion of the Hindu Rashtra, that this is the land of the Hindus, the majoritarianism. The majority's religion is in the country of the majority. Okay, so the two worlds are in collision course. Now, I'm not talking about political parties only, so don't get me wrong. I'm not talking BJP, Congress, Trinamool, left, etc., etc. I'm just talking about
clash of civilizations, which you're talking about.
Two views about our civilization as to who are we. Okay, are we an inclusive, liberal, secular people, or are we people of a particular faith and want and believe that that faith should lead and hold sway over everybody else and everything else in this country? A kind of aggressive nationalism. Okay. Now, the reason it has concerned me, this clash of ideals has concerned me so much, is because its impact, I have felt, has gone beyond the domain of politics. It has invaded into our family lives, our friends.
Yeah.
Okay. So these days, we have been, oftentimes there's bitterness between people who are from the same family, or very close to each other, or close friends who were once close friends, because they're split along these lines. And this great distrust, you only have to follow feed on social media to see the great acrimony, the great hatred that one side shares about the other and vice versa. Okay, it is as if we are finally coming apart as a country, not because of an external war, but because what we think about ourselves. And another partition, a partition of the soul, has started to happen. We are a fractured nation. Okay, so without taking sides, I've written a story in an ideal world, which is a fast-paced, event-driven story which happens inside a small family, a nuclear family, father, mother, son, okay, where these distinctions come to fore and great crisis, psychological crisis, and emotional crisis results. Okay, so that is the novel which is coming out in January.
So are you going to release this in the Jaipur Literary Fest, or?
Release is a strange word these days, because the book will be available from 3rd of January. I will read and discuss it at the Jaipur Literary Festival and many other festivals around India, COVID permitting, as well as in other venues and locations in Kolkata and Delhi.
We'll be more interested to end on a happy note to hear of the other extraordinary book, which is basically a summation of your life's journey, all these years going back to 1982. I keep insisting on 1982 for various reasons. So could you tell us a bit about the other book which you're bringing out? Could be, you might even bring it out in the club fall, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, the other book is different from this novel. I don't mean to position in an ideal world, my novel as a dark novel. Hopefully we'll not see it as a dark novel. You will see that it's a novel also about hope. But the other book is called Movable Feasts. Okay. Now, for the past many decades, Shushmit and I, fueled by a lust for travel, have been traveling all around the world. Okay, in all kinds of destinations. Okay, and we read about them. We're interested in the history, in the cultures, the books written from those parts of the world or about those parts of the world, cinema, art, traditional crafts, handicrafts, and so on and so forth. Okay, and also by a love of food. You see, both of us, Shushmit and I, we cook. We love cooking, and we like experimenting with food. This photograph is from our home in Kolkata. Okay, we love experimenting with food. And so we asked ourselves this question: when does a meal become a feast? You see, all of us have had wonderful meals in restaurants, in home of friends, in many different places in our life. Okay, but which ones do we remember the most? The ones that we remember, that have a permanent place in our minds, the feasts have more than just what's on the table, more than what we just taste. It has to do with the place, maybe associated with travel, the history, the people that we have, we have met along the way, friends that we have met, the books that we have read. And so Shushmit and I, for the first time, collaborated together on a book called Movable Feast. It has 12 feasts. And each feast has dishes with recipes that we cooked, but it's not simply about food. It's about a book about travel, a book about art, a book about memory, a book about friends. Okay, and it has photographs which I've taken over the years of the many decades, and that's also slated for publication sometime early in the next year.
So that's 12 chapters and 12 feasts we're looking forward to.
Yeah.
So end of the year is going to wrap up really well. Kunal, thank you so much for this. I think we have more or less run out of time, but I will hand this back to Shumit, which he'll take on the question answers. I think we should leave some time for members. They've been waiting to get back. Kunal, thank you very much for that candid conversation.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And thank you so much, Kunal. That was so fascinating. I think we could have gone on and on, time permitting. You're such a wonderful storyteller. But we have a couple of questions, so I would like to run them through you. And the first question is from Roma Bhattacharya. And she writes, "Dear Dr. Basu, totally enthralled by your journey, resonated deeply with me Kolkata to Oxford and across the world. Dr. Basu, in higher education in the Western Academy and especially in management and engineering education, is ratiocinative. However, your love for art, theater, experience of falling in love that you describe so lyrically, do you think there are other ways of knowing that is not encouraged in higher education? Can be the pieta be fully captured by Euclidean geometry? This is not a facetious question, but the burgeoning of the digital world and emphasis on algorithms and coding and many liberal arts departments being closed. Are you worried about a future society that may be skewed of the imagination being devalued by society? You value the imagination. Has that given you more happiness than the ratiocinative world? That's from Roma.
Oh, it's a wonderful question. And I think the answer lies in your question, Roma. I am deeply concerned that functional education, vocational education is driving out real education in this world. In the US, departments of philosophy are closing down. Can you believe that? A society without philosophy? Okay. There are fewer students who are studying the liberal arts. History, if you get a PhD in history, it's very hard to find a job. Okay. Now, what that is leading to, and this is a very dear question to me because I just finished teaching a course on Zoom called Literature for Life. Because what the humanities and the arts do is they prepare us for life. They prepare us for situations, they prepare us for people, they prepare us for ourselves, make us self-reflective and say, well, what is it that we want in this world and what do we want from our near and dear ones and from the organizations that we work for? If we become a society or societies where people purely have technical skills and are executing jobs, not based on what they mean to life and the ethics of those jobs, then it will be a very sad state for humanity, and we would have lost more than what we would have gained. So the answer, which is a part of your question, really resonates well with me, that the place for imagination, the place for journeys of many different kinds must be preserved in our minds, without which we would be half humans.
Thank you so much, Kunalda. So the next question, in fact, the question I think sent by Gautam Dasgupta, perhaps he didn't realize that you'd answered during the conversation with Shaun, but I'll just read out the question and I, with Gautam's permission, add a little bit to the question because you've kind of half answered it. So he writes, your writings indicate that the writer is having a soft heart and remains an Indian in letter and spirit. Most specifically, his question is, your story, The Japanese Wife, is a very peculiar love story. How do you get the impetus? And I think you have already explained that. So now my question, in addition to Gautam's, is just adding to that, is that you said that 25 years later, on that stormy night, you sat by and you started writing. So why did it take 25 years and why suddenly that night did this come to you? I'm just curious to know what goes through a mind of an author and a writer, and that, you know, it must have simmered in you for 25 years and then suddenly what triggered that? And while we know what actually that experience you had 25 years back with your friend on the ferry ghat, but why did it take so long and what really drove you to write it on that stormy night?
Yeah, Shumit, the honest answer is I don't know why it took me so long. Well, first of all, in the one easy part of the answer is in the early years since that incident, I was not thinking of writing at all. My mind was elsewhere. I had no plans of becoming a writer. Okay. In fact, my first piece that I wrote and sent off and got published in London Magazine, it's a very prestigious literary magazine. It's called Lenin's Cafe. It's a story about my father. Okay. And me accidentally meeting my father 13 years after his death. So it's a surreal story that I meet my father 13 years after his death in Zurich. And he says, oh, you're here as well. Let's go to Lenin's Cafe. Because it was a cafe where Lenin used to stay in exile just prior to the Bolshevik Revolution. Okay. And then the story starts from there. I had never thought of writing a story, let alone The Japanese Wife, till much later. But it continues to be a mystery why on that night of snowstorm, my mind had traveled back to the Sundarbans. And when it had traveled back to the Sundarbans, why did I think of that particular incident? Okay, I think that the different people try to explain it in this way. And I'm not trying to ask you or anybody to be particularly spiritual, okay? But I really think that there's certain moments in time when inspirations appear in people's minds. They don't have to be literary inspirations. It can be an idea of something else that you want to do, okay? But inspiration does not send you an advance warning. It doesn't tell you that I'm coming now, okay? Or in my life as an academic, when in business, there's so much research on the notion of innovation. How do people come up with innovative ideas? Okay. And there are many academics and many scholars who have tried to sit down and create elaborate models and analytical techniques and say, well, if you do this and this and this and this, then you can become creative. But in practical, in real life of business, you see the most creative ideas come from the unlikeliest of sources, completely unlikely sources. Famous example of Pilkington glass, okay, where Mr. Pilkington was washing dishes in the kitchen and his wife was saying, hurry up, finish the dishes, we have to watch the telly, okay? And when he was washing dishes, suddenly he had the idea of creating a kind of glass, he was a scientist, creating a glass which is shatterproof. And he was not thinking of creating shatterproof glass before. And then he goes back to his laboratory and spends 20 years researching shatterproof glass and creates the gold standard for glass, which we know as Pilkington glass. Okay. So sometimes ideas, the germination of ideas, is inspiration driven. And when that I keep telling myself all the time, Kunal, be inspired. Be inspired, get another story in your mind, because when I get that, that is real a point of celebration for me.
That's wonderful, Kunal. In fact, I think the way you said it and the way you're speaking today, you perhaps would have inspired a lot of us to be inspired by listening to you. But just taking that question a little further, Sharon says, and you are perhaps one of the rare bilingual writers, and you said that, the first line that came to you was, she sent him kites, and that's why you decided to write. So therefore, my question to you is that, were you to write The Japanese Wife in Bangla today, would that be a more compelling story than the one how does language play an important role? Because when you're writing, you think in a language and you write. I mean, a translation is really translating, but when you write, so the question is, if you were to write The Japanese Wife in Bangla, do you think today it would have been a more compelling story in Bangla, or do you think it's still as compelling as it is in English?
Yeah. So two ways to answer that. The first is, well, I would never translate it. I mean, there have been a number of publishers in Bengali publishers who have said, we want to do a book, Japani book. Would you please translate that? It's only a 16-page story. And I said, absolutely not. Because first of all, I don't like translating. Okay, so translation is not my thing. The real answer to your question is, I don't think I would attempt to write The Japanese Wife now. Do you know why? Because when you take on a creative project, when I take on a creative project, I invest everything that I have into it. Okay. And once I've invested everything, I don't want to go back and do it again. So Aparna Sen asked me, when she acquired the rights of The Japanese Wife, if I would write this screenplay. I said no. Okay, I've exhausted all my passion writing this story. It's yours now. So invest your passion into creating the screenplay. And of course, I would be there if you show it to me, and she did. I would give you some ideas. I can give you some say, don't do this or do that, or you can try this. Okay, but it's like this, Shumi, that you've written an essay for your teacher. And your teacher in school says, oh, this is a fantastic essay, Shumi, but I want you to go back and rewrite it again. You would have lost all interest in it.
Makes
so
sense.
Passion is a very exciting thing, because when it manifests itself, it comes as a tremendous inspiration, but it also extinguishes itself.
True.
And, so,
and if I may add that, as two very creative people, like you wrote that, and, you exhausted your creative energy in writing and imagining. So when you read it, there's a certain, and then as a filmmaker, you're taking that entire story in a different medium, from written to, a visual and medium. And therefore you would have, and I think you gave her that liberty to experiment with her passion in her medium that she's very good with, to try and add value to it. And we saw the final product.
Absolutely.
And of course, we all enjoyed it. Okay, the last question, Kunalda, is from Dhruv Kaitan, and wants to know what do you think of your books being converted to audio formats, as in audible formats? Do you think that's something that you would consider?
Oh yeah, very much so. Look, unfortunately, the pandemic struck. Because prior to the pandemic, one of my publishers, I hold the rights to my audiobooks, but one of my publishers in India, I think, and maybe one in the UK, were asking me to record audiobooks. And for some strange reason, they wanted me to read them, okay, rather than have another reader. And those projects were stalled because of the pandemic. But I would love to read. I mean, a small bit of me is stuck with the other A, which is the actor. Okay, and so I would actually love to read out. I love reading out my writing, and so yeah, if if an opportunity came by, I would certainly do that.
Thank you so much, Kunal.
I need to ask the last question. A
Okay.
quick question. Can I have a permission, please?
Yes, please go ahead.
Just a quick one. Kunal, are you a realist or a romanticist?
Oh, that's a really easy one. I'm I'm a complete romantic.
I would have thought so too.
A complete romantic. If I were a realist, would I give up an academic career in order to chart into this really uncertain world of the arts? Look,
And with engineering.
Yeah.
Incidentally, what was your discipline of engineering?
Mechanical
engineering. And he was even, I'm sorry, going back in time, he even thought of being a NASA scientist, a robo scientist.
I was on the space shuttle program. So I worked for NASA in Cape Canaveral for a brief period of time before I came back after my master's. So, and no,
Sorry, I mean, another small trivia I missed out. Kunal also taught in IIM Kolkata for a brief period of a year, close to a year.
About a year. Yeah.
Just about a year. Okay, so
during one of my sabbaticals. Yeah, during one of my sabbaticals. No, I mean, look, it's very poor career advice to give to anybody, saying that, look, abandon your career and become an author, because one should only do it if there is no other way you can lead your life, if that's your passion, because it is incredibly uncertain. One of your books may do brilliantly, and the next 3 books, may go nowhere. Your publishers one day could say that you are, the God's gift to mankind, and the next day can turn their faces away and walk away from you. And all the fuel that you need for this journey should come from inside you, not from outside you.
Well said.
Very well said, Kunal. And I think you've answered that question, because I think most people cannot pursue this is because of one ingredient that's so important is passion. To do something beyond what you're doing. And I think that passion drives, and as you said, the inspiration and the passion. And if you have those two, maybe you can look at this as a career option. But it was excellent. Thank you so much for your time. And on behalf of Bengal Club, we do hope and look forward to hosting you at the club and when you're in Kolkata next. And more importantly is that now that you mentioned 2 books, I'm sure our library subcommittee and all of us would be very happy to launch the book for you in Kolkata at the Bengal Club for our members and their guests. But to do a formal vote of thanks, may I request a member of our library subcommittee, Choitali Moitra. Choitali is, I think, also logged in from London, to offer you the formal vote of thanks. Riveting evening. Thank you so much, Kunalda. Over to you, Choitali.
Dear Shumit, good evening, everybody. After this enthralling evening, it's indeed a pleasure to thank Dr. Kunal Basu for facilitating a glimpse of the hidden phoenix and the mind of his unlikely heroes. Sincere thanks to Mr. Sayan Mukerji for talking to Dr. Basu in the specific manner which could bring out the fearful candor that is always a part of a creative mind, the president of the Bengal Club, the chair, and all the members of the library subcommittee join me in thanking you both wholeheartedly. Many thanks to Shumit, our dear Shumit, for introducing and handling this program so well. And of course, thanks to our own Guru Dash for managing the logistics in the digital end. Thank you again. Good evening and goodbye.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you, Kunalda.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.